Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Councilmember Derek Green to discuss, amongst other issues, the current impasse regarding the public bank. And we'll also be joined by Harvey Rice, the executive director of the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, otherwise known as PICA, and how that authority has been extended and why that's of interest. And I'm told we have Denise Clay Murray here with us.
Hi, how are you?
Good, Denise. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Well, as good as I can be today.
Yeah, yeah. But it's good to see you as
Mhm,
always. And
mhm.
we did an interview just this morning with Council Member Derek Green.
Yeah, and what to me was most interesting about that was all the stuff that went on with the public bank. He didn't see it coming.
Yeah,
And you know,
I didn't either. I wouldn't have guessed
I
that.
don't I don't think anybody did. And the thing is Philadelphia notorious for having some of the pettiest politicians perhaps in the entire world?
Yeah,
Yeah. But generally, if something has been in negotiation, as long as the public bank has been in negotiation, any real issues with it would have come up before the 11th hour, which is what happened here.
yeah,
And you got to wonder what what's the real deal with this?
yeah,
What is the real problem? And because from what I've heard about the bank and from what we've learned, doing stories on it and interviewing people about it here, it seems like a very necessary thing for the city to have, especially if you're in those neighborhoods that are also dealing with crime due to economics and poverty and stuff. If you can't get a loan from Wells Fargo, and let's face it, not everybody can, or if
yeah,
you can't get a loan from any kind of other conventional lending system, having a public bank where you could possibly get the money that you need to start your business, and by extension create a better neighborhood for you and your kids, you know that's you kind of have to explain to me what your problem is with that.
yeah, yeah. So, and that's one of the first things we talk about, and it comes up a couple times in the conversation, because it is such an important thing, and it's such a just an odd thing that happened. Another one of those odd things that happened last week.
Mhm.
Um, so
Last week was just an odd week.
everything that happened last week was just, that's the only word I keep saying over and over again, but that's what it is. Um, so here is our interview with Council Member Derek Green. Councilmember Derek Green, thank you so much for joining us.
No problem.
The first thing that I want to ask you about, we've been talking about the public bank for years now. So last week, the mayor says, "Okay, we're not going to fund it now, and we're not going to appoint a board." So where do we stand on that right now, and what are some of the options that you're looking at?
Well, as we were going through the budget process, and Larry and Denise, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. But as we were going through the budget process, I sent a letter to the administration back on June 3rd, kind of reiterating the statement that I made previously about the desire to get the public bank started and to not only have the appointments to the board, which will be the corporate board, and also $3 million request as part of the budget process. And I reminded the mayor that this legislation was passed 15-1 in council back in the late winter, early spring. and looking forward to working with the administration going forward to address the issues that we're trying to address through the public bank, through the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority, which was a precursor to creating a public bank to address the issues of access to credit, credit enhancements for not only Black and brown businesses, but also hard to lend to entities. I learned in conversations as we were going through the budget process that I'll be getting a letter from the mayor. Then as we were starting to do some advocacy on the state budget, talked with some of my colleagues, and I reiterated that I had not heard back from the mayor. And then shortly thereafter, I received this letter. So from a strategic standpoint, we are looking at a couple different options, and one in reference to the funding. As we go into the fall, there are the opportunities to do a transfer ordinance and possibly use that as a way to fund the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority. And then in reference to the board appointments, we're looking at various ideas. We had a deadline as of June 30th for everyone to apply. So we're going through those applications that we received. But then from a next step in reference to appointments, we're looking at various avenues that we can take in that regard. I just think it's unfortunate considering that, as you stated, we've been talking about this initiative for some time, and we worked for close to, I would say about 9 months with the law department as well as the treasurer's office to come to this state in reference to legislation. So I just think it's unfortunate and a missed opportunity from the administration to support an issue that can help address some of the issues and poverty that we have in the city of Philadelphia. And we all know that we have a, unfortunately, very high poverty rate for a city of the size at 25%.
Yeah, and what's also troubling about this, the administration had said during the committee hearings, we do think PIDC and some other organizations do some of this work already, but at no point that I recall was there any indication that this was going to be what they were going to do. In terms of the board appointments, the legislation says the mayor makes those appointments. Is there a possibility the legislation could be changed so that council could make the appointments?
Well, that's one of the issues that was raised by the Philadelphia Public Banking Coalition, that the administration testified at the hearing, said they had concerns, but never at no point said what those concerns were, other than what you just stated, kind of a macro perspective. Also, when the legislation was passed in council, the mayor could have taken the opportunity to veto the legislation if they really felt this strongly, as stated in this late June letter, that they felt other entities could do some of these same things. And we could have had a robust conversation regarding that. But the mayor failed, or just chose not to want to have that conversation. And as a former banker, one of the issues that the administration said that there are existing entities that can do some of these things. Well, if a PIDC is going to provide a loan to a small business, but now that small business now has to get access to more credit and a larger loan, having that entity receive both a guarantee and a loan is not sound lending policy. You want to have different entities, just like with insurance and reinsurance. An entity that's reinsured is not insured by the same entity. So this helps to spread the risk and makes it less risky for an entity like PIDC. And really the goal of the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority is not to work in competition with PIDC, but work in collaboration with the PIDC or the credit union or other banks, because those institutions, both for-profit and nonprofit, their business model is a model of lending out money. We're trying to provide credit enhancement and guarantees, and that's just not a product that hardly any banks, if at all, provide. And if they do provide a letter credit product, that tends to be in an import-export perspective, not in helping to grow businesses in a community.
So just in regards to the public bank, what people should take away is that there's still a lot to happen. You're working on things, and there's still a ways to go, but there are options.
Right. I just wish the administration would have been more communicative about some of their real concerns as opposed to just allow things to go its course, become law, and it is law. The mayor could easily vetoed it. As in the past, other administrations, when they had serious issues with legislation, they would veto legislation. We have a debate. But that opportunity was not presented because the mayor just did not come up to that level of responsibility.
So switching gears a little bit, City Council passes the budget at the end of June. Just generally, how do you feel that budget turned out? And do you feel satisfied is never the right word, but do you feel comfortable with the amount of money that the city's put into anti-violence programming?
Well, we put a significant amount of money last year into anti-violence initiatives. We put more money this year into anti-violence initiatives. This budget was really a compromise. I was also part of the tax reform working group where we were working with the administration going back to probably last summer, where we were meeting on a regular basis to try to come up with ideas regarding our tax structure. And as we were going through those meetings, the statements made to us coming from the administration was the administration wanted to work with the tax reform working group, which was members of council, those in the private sector, other individuals, trying to come up with new policies to move the city forward. And as we went into the fall and then the winter, we kept meeting with the tax reform working group. And then as we got into the beginning of the year, we were informed that whatever the mayor provides as his budget address would include ideas coming out of the tax reform working group. Now we know that assessments were coming, so we also kept asking, well, what's the makeup of the assessments? How is that going to look? Well, that's coming. That's coming. The mayor gives his budget address, says we're going to work with council and use the information coming from council as part of the budget process. And then I guess it was in mid-spring that the members of council, members of the tax reform working group, read in the paper, oh, here's the assessments for the city of Philadelphia. It's going to be 31% across the board, and here's a tax policy. Well, that's not really working with someone if we're on this path, and then we read in the paper that one party takes the step without the other party. And as I said in city council, and the winter, spring, early summer, we're part of basketball season, so I had basketball on the mind. And so as I stated in city council, I now know how Joel Embiid and Tobias Harris felt when Ben Simmons said, hey, I don't want to play with you guys anymore. Because it was kind of a similar perspective that we got from the administration, that we're going to do our own thing, even though we said we're going to work together. So as we went into the budget process, the mayor proposed raising real estate taxes in a significant way for citizens around the city of Philadelphia. You had Councilmember Johnson, Councilmember O'Neill that had proposals regarding the homestead exemption as a way of raising that. Currently it was 45. The mayor proposed 65. Those two members of council wanted to do 90,000. But we also know from conversations both with a number of businesses, especially Black and brown businesses who were really struggling to survive coming out of the pandemic, they needed to see, and we're looking to see, some reduction on the net income portion of the business income receipt tax, as well as the fact we need to send a message, not just to citizens who are dealing with higher cost of goods, inflation, gas, that we need to get some relief from our expenses, but also we have to find a way, how do we draw citizens back into the city of Philadelphia, especially those who work in the city but live outside the city, and now because of the pandemic have been working remotely for some time and effectively got a raise because they didn't have to pay the wage tax as a non-resident, and also some of the other expenses of transportation and parking and other things. They were not having that because they were now working remotely. So there were a lot of different proposals between the 90,000 homestead exemption, the other proposals from Councilmember Johnson, the Inclusive Growth Coalition, which was both the OIC, Urban League of Philadelphia, the diverse chambers, Greater Philadelphia Chamber of Commerce, other entities wanted to see the net income portion of the business income receipt tax go down pretty significantly, as well as reduction in the wage tax. And so how do we get all those numbers together and come to a compromise was a challenge. But we were then starting to have some, I'll say, late night Zoom conversations with members of council. And after a lot of that reflection on some of the positions from different members of council and working closely with our budget office, I put together a budget compromise that would say, hey, why don't we do an 80,000 homestead exemption? Let's reduce the net income portion of the BERT tax to 5.99, bring it below 6%. Also bring the wage tax below 3.8, and then also have that reduction on the non-resident wage tax as well. And so putting those numbers together, that was a compromise I put together. And then when we ran the numbers, it still gave us a sufficient fund balance. Especially we know that the state was dealing with a significant amount of resources. Back in the month of April, they brought in the highest amount of revenue in the history of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so pulling those together, I then reached out to the administration, Rob DeBell in particular, the Wednesday afternoon of our committee of the whole, and said, hey, here's a compromise. Would that work? And the response we got back was, yes, we ran the numbers. We rather our proposal, which was just the wage tax and not addressing the issues of small businesses, especially Black and brown communities, but they said the numbers work, and that was the compromise that became the budget.
Okay. What are your thoughts on PICA being reconstituted up till 2047?
Well, I was very active in that conversation. I introduced hearings on PICA going back early. I think we introduced that in 2020 because we knew PICA was expiring. There was some debate on how we should change PICA and have it more like a congressional budget office type entity and some other ideas. But the concern was that legislation has to be done in Harrisburg. And if we did some deviation, there were some significant concerns that members of the General Assembly may do some other things with that. So the end result was there was a bill that was introduced by Representative White. Basically just a clean reauthorization. And ultimately that was legislation that was passed, which is important for the city because we do get dollars from the PICA tax that comes into the city of Philadelphia in a significant way.
Right.
And one last thing, it still will provide the ability to have that oversight through a 5-year plan, which I think is one of the other benefits of having this entity, is that that you have another party that's going to be reviewing our 5-year plan to make sure that we're doing things, not just passing a balanced budget for the upcoming fiscal year, but also looking at the impact of future fiscal years, which is important as we're dealing with all of the various issues, trying to balance and keep a balanced city, as well as the issue with the school district and the state and other entities that impact citizens in the city of Philadelphia.
Okay, I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on Hall Monitor.
Hi, Councilman. Thank you for joining us.
No problem.
I guess my first question to you, and it kind of like regards to public bank, were you blindsided by the mayor's decision? Is that something you all have been talking about before in terms of moving the bank forward?
Well, I would say yes, blindsided from the perspective of the position that was taken in the letter. I know there were some issues or concerns that the administration had, but just like any piece of legislation or any issue, there may be issues and concerns, but we have a conversation. The administration's law department and the treasurer's office had worked with us on a weekly basis for almost 9 months. So I knew there were some concerns, but not at the level that was articulated in the letter that no, we're not going to fund this entity, and no, we're not going to make his appointments. That was, if you want to use the word being blindsided, I was blindsided by that type of position, because that's different than just saying, we have some concerns, let's talk about it, let's continue to have the conversation.
So have you spoken to him since about this?
I have not spoken to him. I sent him a letter because I didn't want to go back and forth. So I sent him a letter on June 3rd. And in that letter, I said, listen, if you have questions or concerns about the proposal, please give me a call. I had not heard any response to the letter or a phone call until later when we pressed again to the administration. Then we received this letter.
Okay. Now, you were one of the more outspoken council people when it came to what the mayor had to say on July 4th about I'll be glad when I'm not the mayor. In fact, you were one of the first people to call on him to resign based on that. I guess, what made this rise to the level for you to make that request? And do you think that, because let's face it, Philadelphia has some of the world's most petty politicians in it, that it might have had something to do with what's going on with the public bank?
Well, I made that statement, one, that was after that back and forth regarding the Philadelphia Public Financial Authority. So those two were not connected. But ultimately, the mayor stated that he was unhappy. He stated that he hated having 4th of July, hated having the NFL draft, hated having the DNC, or having the Pope here. And literally 2 weeks earlier, we were just awarded the World Cup. And still with the World Cup, we don't know how many games we will receive. So I guess my concern is that when someone is expressing that level of frustration and resignation in by their own statements, and then also as you talk, and I'm sure you talk as both of you are journalists and see, the mayor prior to that Wednesday press conference of last week has not, from my understanding, had an in-person press conference since before the pandemic. Vast people come to me and say, no, I haven't seen the mayor. I'm not sure what's going on this issue or that issue. And I also hear that from outside the city. I serve as president of Democratic municipal officials around the country, as well serve as the executive committee member for National League of Cities. And various mayors, other elected officials say to me, what's going on with Philadelphia? So there seems to be a pulling back by actions by the mayor. And I think his statements were something that many of us have felt that he had been doing. I just hope now that he made a retraction and says he still wants to be mayor, that we're going to see that same level of energy, because we're all exhausted and frustrated by the level of gun violence in our city. I mean, he was giving these statements after we had not had a Welcome America event in 2 years. And then having this event, we had an officer from the city of Philadelphia, undersheriff for Montgomery County, were both injured by gun violence. Earlier in the day, we heard about the mass shooting in Highland Park, Illinois. But even though we know that the Supreme Court has taken a very, interesting perspective on the Second Amendment, we've had some other very challenging rulings by the Supreme Court. We can't give up. People look to elected officials for leadership and vision, how we're going to get through these issues. We look at what happened and what's happening in Ukraine. A year ago, people were kind of questioning, why is Vladimir Zelensky president of this country? Isn't he kind of an entertainer? But when his sovereign nation was attacked by Russia, he stepped up to provide leadership for his citizens who are going through such a challenging time being bombed. I, as president of Democratic municipal officials, had the unfortunate opportunity to talk with Mayor Byron Brown the day after the mass shooting in Buffalo. But he was providing leadership for citizens in a time of crisis. And I think that's what we need to do going forward. And that's why I made that statement, because of the fact that the mayor made those statements in a, he was half chuckled, even though it was outside of the hospital for two officers. But even with the challenge of the gun violence, we still had to keep pushing forward with new ideas. That's why I introduced legislation regarding body armor, to say, listen, if you're a manufacturer of body armor, you need to register that information with the city of Philadelphia. And if you're a citizen in the city of Philadelphia, you need to register that body armor with our city as well. Because we're seeing more and more of these mass shootings having people wearing body armor. But even though these things are happening more and more frequently, even on a holiday like 4th of July, we can't just give up and make statements like that. We have to continue to push forward, push for new ideas, new concepts, to give the citizens in the city of Philadelphia the perspective that we are trying to move in a better direction, to provide leadership and vision for the betterment of our city.
Okay. Now, it feels to a lot of us who cover politics as journalists that the mayor's race for 2023 has pretty much started. There were, during the last city council meeting, folks were making speeches that made it sound as if they're about to throw their hat in the ring, and you were one of those people. So what I wanted to find out from you, knowing that you're probably not going to tell us whether or not you're running right now, although it's a scoop that Larry and I would love to have, is it something you're thinking about? And when will you know whether or not you're doing it?
Well, the last session of council provided an opportunity for me to have some reflections on my time in council. And that was because my chief legislative aide, Frank Iannuzzi, was leaving to go to another opportunity within the city. And just like myself, who started I started in council as a legislative aide in council, and then was able and fortunate enough to be elected by city council. I reflected and was thinking about, where I've come in my path, not only through city council, but also being a former deputy city solicitor and a former assistant district attorney during my years of service to the citizens of the city of Philadelphia. So people have been asking me about what my future will be for some time, from almost the beginning of my time as a member of city council. I am looking forward to moving and doing what I can to help improve our city by providing leadership. And I believe I can provide that leadership from a executive perspective. So I'm looking at the next phase. As we know, the mayor's term limited. And so there'll be opportunity to have that conversation in a much more detailed way in the coming weeks.
Okay. Now, during the press conference that City Council had after what happened at Welcome America, there was talk about things that folks could do to kind of get a better handle on the gun violence problem.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those things that came up was stop and frisk.
Mm-hmm.
A few years back, there was a referendum put on the ballot where city residents voted and said, we do not want stop and frisk going on here. And, although Council President Clark said constitutional stop and frisk, to people in neighborhoods where stop and frisk was being done, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of constitutionality to it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something council's going to address in the next session? And what are some of the, what do you think are some good ideas that we might be able to use that won't necessarily lead to people just, feeling unsafe in their own communities?
Well, City Hall has 18 independently elected officials, and in City Council there are members who are part of leadership that were espousing the idea of returning back to stop and frisk. I was not part of that conversation. I believe I'm the only one, except I think David O also served in law enforcement as a member of District Attorney's Office as well. So I know from my own personal experience being a prosecutor here in the city of Philadelphia and also being a prosecutor in Delaware, that the idea of just stopping and frisking people based on certain perspectives is not something that we should be doing in the city of Philadelphia. If you look at the data, just stopping and frisking people without having a reasonable suspicion, which is the law under Terry v. Ohio, that a crime has been committed or is about to be committed, really does not make sense, especially when you look at the fact that the vast majority of the violence that's occurring in the city of Philadelphia is coming from a small segment of individuals. That's why I was so supportive of focused deterrence, because it focuses on that specific narrow perspective where you have a situation where it's cooperation between the police department, district attorney's office, first judicial district, and then based entire city government. So if someone has outstanding, either outstanding detainer or other type of outstanding is on probation, that you go back in front of that same judge. So she or he can say, listen, if you come back in front of me, there's going to be some repercussions for those actions. And I think what people are looking for is a sense of, we want criminal justice reform, but we also want accountability. People want to see both safety and justice. And I think we have done this in the past. If you look at the previous administrations, how they've been able to reduce violence in our city, especially gun violence, by having that kind of a more holistic approach. So I think the steps that council's done over the past couple of years, providing more dollars for anti-violence initiatives is important. We need to make sure that we're doing that in a way that's measurable, so we're getting the outcomes that we need. But we also need to have a same type of review of our police department and district attorney's office. Are we getting a return on our investment in the dollars we put into both those agencies? Because you can make strong arguments that both agencies have not led to the level that they should be in reference to gun case convictions in the district attorney's office, as well as clearances of cases in the police department. Although they both have done some increases in those perspectives. But this has to be a holistic approach on how we address these issues. And I think the idea of just going back to stopping and frisking people is not the way we should do. And I'm talking to someone as a 6'3" African-American man who was racially profiled once while leaving the DA's office. So I have understanding of both perspectives, both from a law enforcement perspective, but also being a person of color who was racially profiled leaving the DA's office based on some of the ideas like stop and frisk.
Okay, I have one question, and it's actually a fun question. Technically, you are on summer vacation because council isn't meeting. I mean, I said technically.
Well, I would say that the council is in recess to September 15th. However, as you see, I am in my office, as I've been in my office every day, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. In fact, my staff has been here since August of 2021. And because we're here every day, we've received a voluminous number of calls because I'm an at-large council member and I get out and about, try to get out of City Hall as much as possible. But we've been here since last August trying to serve the constituents in the city of Philadelphia.
Okay. But you are going to take a vacation, right?
Oh, yeah.
You are going to take a vacation.
My wife is like, you can be in council all day, but we're going to be down the beach and show you a photo of us at the beach saying, I don't say wish you were here, we are here.
Right. So I guess is the beach kind of going to be like the main place you hang out when you do leave the office, or do you have something special planned, like a family reunion or something?
So it's interesting you would say that. We typically go to Brigantine to vacation because that's close, about an hour away. But also during the beginning of the pandemic, I started a family Zoom call with my dad's side of the family and my mother's side of the family. We were doing this every other Saturday at 10 a.m.
Mhm.
Then as things started to wane with COVID-19, we moved that to once a month. So I do my dad's side at 10 o'clock, my mother's side at 11 o'clock. So my father's side of the family is from outside of Greenville, North Carolina. Unfortunately, my uncle passed in February. And so now we are transitioning some of the property to other family members. And so on our call this past Saturday, we just talked about putting together a family reunion for next year for fall of 2023. I'm also helping to transition our family farm that my grandfather purchased in 1943 out of my dad's name and my aunt's name, who still lives in Greenville, to my name. And so looking at possibly going down to Greenville as well over the summer to take a look at the farm again as we continue to make some transition. So I am a third generation farmer, as well as a city employee serving the citizens of the city of Philadelphia. So Brigantine and Greenville could be my summer getaways, as well as reading on my front porch.
Okay. Of course, now I have this mental picture of you being a gentleman farmer and raising crops and stuff.
Well, we grew, it's interesting. Our family grew tobacco up until my first year of law school, so 1996. We now just grow corn and cotton. So we rent the farm out to a local farmer. And so that was a conversation I had with my aunt over the weekend about the process of me getting more involved and helping to address some of those issues.
Okay.
I like the
Well,
gentleman farmer idea. I may have to use that as a future perspective.
well, hey, it fits. Well, I'm going to turn this back over to Larry McGlynn, my co-host. Hey, Larry, you have any additional questions?
No, thank you, Denise. Councilmember, someday, at some point, I want to hear more about that farm. That's fascinating to me.
It's very fascinating just to learn about crop rotation and corn versus cotton, and just the history of Black farmers is very interesting in this country.
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, Councilmember, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be with both of you and your viewers and listeners.
Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website, www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHWWPPM. We'd like to thank Councilmember Green for being with us. And Denise, I want to mention one thing. When you asked him about the possibility of running for mayor, he said those are conversations we're going to have in the coming weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a, maybe he didn't mean to say it exactly that way, but he did. So
yeah. Well, hey, I was trying to get us some, I was trying to make it so we could break some news here,
Yeah.
Got to look out for the brand.
Well, the big, we talked about a lot in that interview, and all, I think, important things and interesting things, but what's going on with the public bank in particular, we cover that a lot, but that's something we're going to be keeping a very close eye on. My suspicion is that won't be resolved before the new council term begins. If they have to make legislative changes, right, it would have to be in the fall term. But it's just another curveball that we've seen. So it's something that we're going to be keeping an eye on. Now we have one more interview for you with the executive director of PICA, the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Agency, Harvey Rice. And Mr. Rice was good enough to join us to talk about the legislation that expands PICA beyond its current sunset date. And he's going to walk you through what all that means in this interview. So here's our interview with Mr. Harvey Rice. Okay, Harvey Rice, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome, Larry. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what PICA is and how it came to exist?
PICA came to exist in 1991. At that time, Philadelphia was on the brink of bankruptcy. The 80s during the 80s and during the Reagan administration, we saw federal funding cut to cities all across the country. And Philadelphia was no exception. Federal funding was cut. And then we saw the advent of homelessness and the crack epidemic. So those services need to be provided. Federal funding was cut. The city kept on providing those services as well as others without federal funding. And so by the late 1980s, Philadelphia was in a serious financial situation. And we had, in 1991, we had a new mayor, Ed Rendell, and they didn't want, the state and the city didn't want the city to go bankrupt. So what they did was they joined together, the state and the city, the leadership, and decided that the state had a better bond rating than Philadelphia at the time. Philadelphia was at junk bond status. And so that the state would issue bonds and float money to get the city out of this deficit. And that, and going forward, as part of that accommodation and that working together, the state said, well, we're going to form an independent authority, which is a state authority, to oversee the city of Philadelphia's finances and to mandate that the city submit a 5-year plan so that we have a 5-year look at in the future, so that none of these financial surprises would occur. So as a part of that, they created this authority, which is the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, to oversee the city's finances. And one of the main functions of that is the city submits to PICA a 5-year plan every year. PICA reviews and analyzes it and makes a report, the staff does, to the board considers it, and then votes on it. And it has to be done within a certain period of time, 30 days from the time it's submitted by the city. So that is the main function of PICA, as well as the issuing of the bonds and paying off those bonds over the 30-year life of PICA. So we're almost there. Next June would be all the bonds will be paid, all the current bonds will be paid off. And then PICA, under the old legislation act, would be going into, would be sunsetting at that time. So subsequently, the city and thought, well, PICA is a very good thing for us, and for various reasons, and we would like to see it extended. So working with the legislature, they worked with the legislature and had a bill passed unanimously, bipartisan, in both the House and the Senate, which the governor just signed last week, extending us till at least 2047.
And what are some of those reasons why it makes sense to keep PICA in place for the foreseeable future?
Well, during let me step back a little bit. During our tenure, not only was PICA looking at 5-year plans every year and working with the city to make sure that their assumptions are reasonable and appropriate, because they have to project revenue collections 5 years out, as well as project what the obligations, the cost for city services will be 5 years out and each year. So, but in addition to that, PICA has, on a monthly basis, has issued revenue reports to keep the public informed, so that we don't wait every year to see how the city's doing revenue wise. We issue revenue reports. Last 2 years since the pandemic, we've been issuing obligations reports, the cost of city services, to make sure that they're working within their budget. And we mandated, and that they aren't mandated by the statute, but it was just something that Pike had decided to do to bring transparency into the budget process and the 5-year plan process over the course of the year. Also in the statute, the city is every quarter is to provide revenue information, as well as performance of city departments and metrics, as well as expenses of city government. And we issue those quarterly reports also. And last 3 years, we've been issuing quarterly and annually overtime reports, because the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, we were seeing that overtime was just increasing every year for the last 10, 11 years. And while the size of city government was shrinking, the personnel was shrinking. So in doing this, we've tried to have the city do a better job of looking and working with departments on their overtime allocations and their need and justification for overtime. And so we can keep those costs down, because keeping those costs down frees up money for other city services, and especially with what's occurring in the city now with gun violence, that money could be better spent into gun violence programs or police programs than in other programs where maybe overtime isn't really necessary. So so we do that also during the year. And then also we do studies on our own for the city. We work with the city, though, because we have the finances to assist the city in certain problems or concerns that they have. We about 5 years ago issued a comprehensive pension report on the pension system. And Pike is very pleased to say that the city enacted a lot of the reforms that we recommended in that pension plan and that pension report. We've pushed the city to do performance-based budgeting, which is budgeting where you just don't allocate a specific amount to a department. They have to come in and prove to budget what they need it for. And then you look at and you weigh that, you compare that to the year prior or the 2 years prior to see, well, you received those funds for this and you're supposed to have this metric or this outcome. Have you reached that? If not, then maybe we're not spending the money in the right area of this department. So now all city departments, except for a few independent agencies, are on performance-based budgeting. So that was through Pike's advocacy. Also, we've the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund, which is the rainy day fund, was a Pike recommendation. And now the city has it. They've had it since 2011. And right before the pandemic hit, they had money in the BSR. And then they had to use that right when the pandemic hit, that following fiscal year. So it was just another recommendation of ours, as well as we asked them, because healthcare costs are going up and everywhere, and in personal healthcare costs as well as businesses costs for their employees. So we recommended the city years back to look at their healthcare plans for their workers and make any modifications they could to bring down those costs, which they did. So Pike has been along the way, has been working, we look at our role as, and in our name is cooperation. So we like to work with the city and say, this is what we believe are the concerns that you have or the problems that are arising that we need to curtail some cost. And we work with them. And I think that is a better way of interaction, because I think more things have gotten done on a positive way by the city in helping bring costs down, make it more effective and efficient, thus better efficiencies for the taxpayers.
Okay. One of the things that I'm interested in, our show's interested in, our listeners are interested in, is the actual process. So, the city budget has to be completed by June 30th, so it can go into effect July 1st. This year, I think it was passed on the 23rd of June. When that happens, do you automatically get the budget and you have like a week to review it and make your recommendation? How does that kind of work?
Well, what occurs, the mayor does his budget address sometime in February or March, depending on when they decide to do it. But so at that point, we get a proposed plan of sort of what they're giving to council, at least for the first year budget, or the first year plans budget, and then subsequent the 4 years after that. So we start our process of just reviewing that, and it's more of we review the departments and just some other, because we know that's going to change. The numbers are going to change come June with city council. And then city council has their budget hearings, which we attend and follow them as part of our review process. And we see whatever concerns or issues they may raise, and we make sure that we're looking at those also, as among any other issues that we may come up and find. And then after city council's done, we're at that point, we're still looking and at all departments' budgets. And then we decide to bring in about 15 departments for meetings with us. And we have meetings with those departments. So this is all taking place before the budget is passed by city council at the end of June. Once that budget's passed, then the city can decide of when to submit the plan. They might have to adjust it after whatever changes city council makes to that first year's budget. And that might not only affect the first year, but subsequent years of the plan. So they have to make adjustments to the plan. So they could send it over in 2 or 3 days, or it could be a week. This year was almost a week after city council. I think it was 6 days. I think we got it the Wednesday after. So once we receive that, the clock starts ticking for us. We have 30 days to review and analyze, write a report, send it to the board, give them enough time and opportunity to go through that so they can make a educated decision when they come to the board meeting 30 days later. And they must consider it within those 30 days. If they don't consider it within the 30 days, then under the statute, it's deemed approved. So that I don't think it's ever happened in the 30 years of plans. This will be our 31st. And so then we submit to the board a report. We try to get it to them a week to 5 days ahead of time, because it's a very lengthy report. We hire an outside economist who helps us with the revenue projections. He has his own models. He works with the city revenue department and their consultants to see if he believes what they're putting forward is reasonable or appropriate. And then we submit it to the board. We have the annual board meeting, and the board votes on it and votes to consider to approve it or reject it. It's a 5-member board. The board is appointed one by the governor has an appointment, the majority in the Senate and the minority in the Senate has an appointment, and then the Speaker of the House and the minority leader of the House has an appointment. So there's 5, and at all times it's, it could be 3 one party and 2 one party. It all depends on the party of the governor is of. So they consider it and they vote on it, and they've never rejected a plan outright. I remember a couple years ago, while we were going through our process, we were concerned about the city's business income receipt tax numbers that they had there going forward. And so that we said to the city, we got to get a combination here. We can't recommend to the board to approve this right now because your numbers are not within our economist model, and it's going to skew the fund balance if we go by ours. So that we work with them during this process if need be also. And then the controller also issues, we ask the controller to issue an opinion on the 5-year plan, and she does it according to ACE accounting auditing standards. and gives us an opinion, which we also take into consideration as well as the board.
Theoretically, if the board did reject a 5-year plan, would the city have to go back to the drawing board and try again and have it to you by a certain amount of time?
Yes, the city, I think it would be 15 days from the time, and if we would reject it, we would reject it and we would tell them the reasons why it's rejected. So then they would have to go back and cure it. If they didn't go back and cure it, then we could ask the state treasurer and the governor to stop sending money to the city, the state money to the city. There's a lot of exceptions. There's a list of exceptions that they couldn't not send, but until they cured it, came back, and a reasonable plan was adopted. That has never occurred, I think, because the process was instrumental in the way it was prepared and put together to allow that process to work as it's going on with the city, so that there's at the end, everything has been put into place, and any questions or concerns have been solved by the time the report is written.
Right. So it's unlikely that we'd ever get to that point.
Right.
Does the recently passed legislation change anything that PICA does?
The only aspect of what PICA does is the bonds. The new legislation has us until 2047 unless there's still bonds outstanding, and the city can only request us to issue bonds on their behalf the first 3 years out of each 10-year period. So say it started in 25, so they have 25, 26, and 27. They could request, and we could issue bonds. Then the next 7 years of that 10-year frame, no bonds could be issued. And then the next 10 years will start that cycle all over again. So that has been the only major change in the legislation. Everything else stays the same. The board stays the same. The appointment, the makeup of the board, the collection of the revenue. Right now, the revenue, we get 1.5% of the city wage tax, and that funds, we pay off the debt of the bonds, and some money funds our operations, and the rest goes over to the city. That'll all stay the same. If there's no bonds, then we'll only take off what our expenses are, and then the rest goes back to the city.
So if the city wanted to take out more bonds, which, the state still has a better bond rating than the city.
Right. Our bond rating's better than the city's.
Yeah. So it would be, they'd save money in the long run if they did that. So does that mean they would have 2025, 2026, and 2027 to consider doing that in that first 10-year period? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And
that's for capital projects.
Capital projects.
Right.
If they were to do that, is it just the board that would approve it, or does it go to the state legislature? How?
It's just the board. It's just.
Okay. There was just a minute or two left there that will be in our newsletter this week when we send it out. We'd like to thank Mr. Harvey Rice for being with us, as well as Councilmember Derek Green. And Denise, I'd like to thank you as always. Next week, we, amongst other things, we're going to have a conversation with the water department about some new programs they're rolling out. So that's going to be interesting. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you next week.